So reading about the Day of Atonement in the book of Leviticus brings up all sorts of questions for us in the 21st century. This idea of sacred space or holy space is not really a regular feature of today's Christian worship, but it clearly was to ancient Israel. So how did they understand holy ground and holy space, especially considering the serious rules for the priests when they would approach the Holy of Holies? So the Holy of Holies was only to be entered on the Day of Atonement by the high priest after he had ritually purified himself and offered a sacrifice for his sin. The Day of Atonement's purpose was cleansing. The sacrifices and rituals removed the nation's sin so that God's presence could remain among them. And symbolically, it purified the tabernacle and holy space itself so that God could continue meeting with Israel there. Now, the idea of sacred space, temples, and tabernacles that we see in the Bible were actually largely shared by the cultures that surrounded Israel in the ancient Near East. Interestingly, there were certain sites that were believed to be connection points between heaven and earth, which is an idea we do see come out in Genesis in the life of Jacob when he has a dream at Bethel of a staircase on which angels were ascending and descending. So, in the other cultures surrounding Israel, when a temple would be built, a sacred site would be sought out or decided on through divination. Now, later in Israel's history, King David would be directed by God to the location of his future temple. But here in Leviticus, the Israelites are living in the wilderness in a transitory state. So the tabernacle is portable, obviously. The sacred space becomes wherever God chooses to show up. His presence is what creates sacred space. Both of the Israelites and all of the surrounding ancient cultures aim to protect sacred space by setting up progressive barriers that marked out progressively holy spaces. So in the tabernacle, this looked like the fenced courtyard, then the covered holy place, and then the separated Holy of Holies. This structure emphasized the holiness of God, and it protected the holy place from being corrupted in any way from impurity, and ensured that only the holiest of people approached God's perfect holiness. In the ancient world, the temple was seen as the center of life. They were houses, residing places for gods. So in the pagan world, mankind actually worked to strike a balance. They offered sacrifices and performed rituals to take care of their god's physical needs so that the god could focus on their work of maintaining life, crops, health, warfare, whatever their specialty was. So the sacrifices of food and drink were seen to physically cross into the spiritual world to feed their god. And the process was accomplished through rituals of opening the mouth of an idol and through rituals like the burning of sacrifices and offerings to transmit them into the heavens and through pouring out drinks onto the ground. Now, in Israel, the tabernacle was not seen as a house for God, but it did house the place where God would meet with Israel, who was represented by their high priest. The tabernacle did not house an idol, an image of God. Instead, it had the Ark of the Covenant, which held, of course, the covenant, the basis of that relationship between Israel and God. When the covenant was in good standing, God's presence could and would be with Israel. So then it's no wonder that God chose to appear above the physical copy of that covenant. In Israel, too, the tabernacle seems to have been the center of life, and sacrifices and rituals were commanded by God in the same methods we see outside of Israel, the burning of sacrifices and offerings and the pouring out of drink offerings to give them or transmit them to God. However, sacrifices in Israel were about thanking God for his provision to the people and about recognizing that human sin needed God's pardon. Specifically, the blood of the sacrifices was seen to have a purifying element. The extent of the blood rituals recorded in the law of the Bible seems to have been unique to Israel. Israel needed to keep their need for God's forgiveness front and center. And though the rituals that were to take place on the Day of Atonement do have some ancient parallels, like the scapegoat sacrifice and the need to purify the tabernacle or temple, in other cultures, the king and the priests alone were purified. But in Israel, it was the whole nation who was purified, driving home the point that God wasn't just a petty or lower God. He was actually the God of the entire world. And it wasn't just the Levites who were his priests, but the whole nation of Israel. See, God had a global agenda, and Israel was called to mediate God's plan of salvation for the world.
What's interesting about this is that when, in terms of feeding the gods, okay, this was a common thing in the ancient culture. But God, several places in the Bible, it says, Paul said this, for example, in Acts 17, 1,000 years after the temple was built and all of that, he doesn't live on food. You know,
yeah,
God
and in Psalm 50, God says, I don't, like, even if I was hungry, I wouldn't ask you, but I don't eat the meat of bulls or drink the blood of goats. I don't do that.
So God steps out of that presentation, and that's really important to remember.
And reverses it. The people's offerings to God were thanking him for his provision of food to the people.
Very good. Yeah. Excellent, Corie.
Thank you so much for watching. We want to keep producing high-quality biblical content, but we can't do it without your support. If you feel called to support us, please click the link in the description under Donate. Your support really means a lot to us.